For a little bit of context, anybody just tuning in to a live stream of mine for the first time, we are making some, I guess, promotional materials for School for the Socially Inept. I wanted people to get a chance to meet some of the hosts and hear a little bit about the way that they see the world. These are things that I'm going to be editing to put up on YouTube. So, and I figured if I'm going to be doing that, might as well live stream it. And it appears that after some initial technical hiccups, we are live now. So, here with me today, I've got David Yu, and I'm very excited about this. David is an endlessly fascinating person. And David, would you like me to ask you the same question I asked you in the aborted attempt, or should I ask a new one for an introduction question?
Uh, your choice. Maybe I'll mix both, depending on what you ask, I guess.
Yeah. So what I asked David before, when sadly he was not appearing on the live stream, apparently, was how did you become the person that you are today?
And well, I guess I will continue with that then. Uh, yeah. So, catching up to where I was starting to respond, I think these questions are often quite difficult to answer for me. And I try not to ask them, but end up asking them myself as well. And uh, I think in my case, a big part of what made me me is probably the fact that I experienced my life having taken very drastic shifts, like distinct world to distinct world to distinct world, in such a way that it gave me um, means to like step out of the ladder over and over again until you have a better sense that, oh, maybe the ladder is rather not that like all pervasive and dominating or something. And then that of course just brings, I think, a tougher question. Okay, well then, if not these ladders or if not that ladder, which ladder and why are there even ladders? And that can be more confusing than how do you just climb the next rung. And But I think more so, I'm glad that I am not worried about the next rung and more so wondering about why are there all these ladders in the first place. Um, and I think seeing a lot of different, seeing a lot of
That's a great answer. I'm curious. So you told me a story once, and I'm not sure I remember too many specifics, but I do mention it to people every once in a while. You talked your way into be, just kind of your developed your own role at more than one tech company, I believe. You walked in and said, "You guys need an anthropologist. Here's why, and here's why it should be me." Is that roughly in line with what actually happened?
roughly in line, yeah. So basically, the story goes that so I was originally in tech startups for a few years, and then I left, and when I left, I got into the whole EA rationality scene, which I imagine a decent portion of your audience would be familiar with. And uh, Through that, as I kind of left the EA rationality scene, I got quite interested in how organizational theory worked. Specifically, like, why is it that there were so many really intelligent people, but intelligence seems a bit orthogonal to coordination, which was kind of surprising to me. I would have guessed, perhaps, like, I think younger me would have guessed that if you take really intelligent people, they should be able to coordinate well. You can talk about all of the different dynamics of like corrupted incentives and whatnot. So surely you would be immune, right? But turns out not really. And so why is that really got my interest? I started to read a lot about organizational development, organizational theory, and as it happens, I also really like. I mean, I think you describe it as a little more nice and beautiful, whereas in reality, what I needed was a job and money. Um, and I was very interested in turning what I was thinking about into a viable economic livelihood. And through connections, I was introduced to a CEO of a tech company in Canada, and we got to talking, and we resonated a lot with each other's sentiments around how to build a culture in a company. And it emerged that why don't we trial and do a period where I come on as almost like well, eventually it did get formally. I was formally the anthropologist at this company, and it led to some very interesting insights, as well as eventually, um, how long did it ultimately last? Something like 8 months or something like that. Eventually, I was let go along a round of layoffs, um, and the experience was a very unique one, and it was a big symbol for me of like, yes, you can in fact work out economic opportunities that completely align with your interests. Um, Yeah, so that I think that would be a more whole telling of that story.
What were, and just as we're on this topic, briefly, what were a couple of the most interesting things that you feel like you learned?
Sure. One, well, I mean, I guess in line with the School for Socially Inept, one of the things that I learned, I was in a company that did advertisement tech or media tech, so it's in the realm of marketing, and I was still in the stage of like early 20s and basically wearing sweatpants all the time. For the most part, I just thought about subjects. It didn't really occur to me that my presentation really mattered all that much. Like if I was going on a date or something, I would dress up. But if I was going on to work, I prefer just, I don't know, wear a t-shirt and sweatpants. And for a few times, my the CEO was like, "You should dress up a little more." And keep in, this is like a post Series A company with 50 people, and like people are also like, because they were in marketing, all like quite well put together, and so I was quite sticking out like a sore thumb. And so one of the things that I learned after that, and also like in the latter half of that, was like, yeah, it probably does make sense, and it really helps other people listen to you when you are not dressed like a hobo, and that this is not all contexts were as friendly as, let's say, Berkeley at young people dressing like hobos and talking about intellectual subjects all the time or something. That was one thing. A more serious thing might be something like um, the anthropologist role, I think, is very central. If something like anyone can be an anthropologist the moment you realize that you are always in some culture or another. And so in that case, you have an effect of recognizing that no matter what you're observing, you are always observing in context. And in fact, when you're observing it, the context is being influenced by your observations. And so I remember very clearly at one point, because at the time I was also thinking a lot about trauma and how it informs a person's development. And I remember at the time I was talking to a sales rep about kind of like sort of, oh, how did you become the way that you were? And as soon as I got a little bit into it, and I think quite appropriately went, and I literally, like verbatim, something like, easy there, Freud, like, we're not going to get into that today. And I was a bit like surprised. It's like, oh, I was just trying to understand kind of your psychic makeup, right? And it didn't occur to me that it's probably not that reasonable to just dive right into your coworker's like psychological background or something. As much as we might hope for such an organization, naively trying to go towards that will meet resistances that are surprising and sometimes detrimental to your attempt to understand the organization and its people better.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about, if you're up to sharing some of the ways that your understanding about culture and about organizational theory. How does that apply to groups that are not companies, and how has that sort of been reflected in your life in other ways?
One moment. How does it apply to groups outside of companies? Yeah, I think so. Culture could potentially be described as something like the contours of the shape in which we all walk in, or something like the spherical globe influences how we navigate it. Where similarly, culture sort of like is the shape of um, the intersubjective reality field that we're in or something. And so having an understanding of how where the valleys and the hills lies gives you an advantage in terms of what can be done, what can't be done, why those things can be done, why those things cannot be done, and also what might you be able to do to influence the shape of the hills and valleys themselves. um, I think rather than jumping from, let's say, companies to perhaps say social movements like effective altruism, or even perhaps closer, let's say what Vibe Camp might be like, it's actually just easier to very quickly go to what's immediately already around all of us. Let's say a family unit. Like my mother and I share some culture. Some culture. We speak Chinese, but also like our particular brand of Chinese that includes English words, because a lot of immigrant families end up evolving that way. What we're able to talk about is quite different, and lacking perspective on that can often blind ourselves to potential intervention. So to give a concrete example here, I have a very open line of communication with my mom about finances. She raised me in a way that taught me a lot about how at least a good middle class should be able to properly manage their wealth. Um, And my partner's family, for example, does not talk about finances very much at all. And so it's very strange to her, for instance, that I'm able to talk about, oh, how much savings do you have left, mom? And what does that mean? How do you think about your retirement? And what about your expenditures and so forth? On the other hand, though, my partner's family are far more capable of, when they asked me, when they first met me, oh, what do you do, David? I'm like, oh, I do this thing. It's like, do you like it? Yes, I do. Wonderful. Whereas in my context, it's far more like, why do you think that will make enough money? Will that provide enough security? And I think being familiar, getting into how these cultures differ, give us perspectives and leverages. And so to that end, when my partner interfaces with my mother, that is to say, the intersection of two cultures creates new possibilities that previously was impossible. I cannot give a certain kind of positive compliment to my mom in a way that easily lands. But to my partner, who just does that naturally and also is new, can then introduce norms in a way that I, no matter how hard I push, will be able to introduce. And recognizing these, and because as the world gets more fragmented and multilateral, there will be more and more of these intersections and finding, and as a result, these intersections contain unique possibilities to be captured, and those who are literate in how culture work will be able to capture it.
I love that, especially the examples that you gave. I have a hard time also putting not putting my own sort of negative valence on certain types of cultures that aren't necessarily ones that I like as much. And so that was what you just said was pretty powerful. And I think also it relates to one of, is it a workshop, discussion, class? How would you describe it? The for the how different worldviews enable and influence communication, I believe was the title.
Yeah, yeah. So this is probably going to be a workshop, and to give perhaps a little teaser for it, I find very interesting that I come from very atheistic and STEM-like backgrounds. So when people talk about like the Bible in the form of, oh, say whether it's evolution is false or I don't know, that the Earth is only 6,000 years old or whatever other type of stereotypical beliefs that, let's say, Christians have. Um, there's an interesting phenomenon of if you have inhabited broadly in one culture or world or context or however you want to label it, these beliefs can be quite, I wouldn't even say offensive. It's something like stimulating. It's like, oh, that's not what I believe. And in fact, it's so not what I believe. It basically like refutes everything that I believe all at once or something. And noticing when these feelings come up and noticing that to the extent that we can contain and even suspend that feeling a little bit, we might delve a little bit into what is lost as a result. And so, what I mean by this is quite literally, for instance, if everything a Christian might say, or Muslim, or whoever might say, would refute much of what I believe, basically am unable to gain access into their world. And that very concretely has two unfortunate disadvantages. One is something to whatever extent that that worldview has value, they would not be able to access it. So, for instance, people who are more native to my circles might not be very into astrology, let's say. But to the extent that there are some hundreds of millions of people in the world that really value astrology, whatever value they may be getting out of it would then be inaccessible to me at the same time. And second of all, the people who actually believe in it, I also lose access to the ability to relate with them too, understanding why it is that they're able to get value out of it. And I hope this is a workshop that I've run a couple of times, um, uh, to try and play with what happens when we are stimulated by worldviews that are foreign to ourselves and what we're able to perhaps elicit out of playing with these foreign worlds or something.
I love that, and it seems like it's the kind of thing that will become increasingly necessary as we sort of move forward to this very fragmented and polarized landscape that we found ourselves in.
It's like when we're describing the world as increasingly fragmented and multi-polarized and whatever, it's to claim that at the same time there are people who I think both of us share in there are people in circles that we both inhabit who cares a lot about pluralism, right? And it's something like or diversity, if you will, but we have to recognize that the phenomenon of fragmentation and pluralism are descriptively in fact the same world. It's the meaning that's different. And so necessarily we need to take on the practices that changes the meaning of how we interpret a world of fragmentation as one that is not so much fragmented, but rather plural. It's sort of transforming the notion of what differences even mean, which is a very, I'd say, yeah, a character transforming type of practice. When people say they want pluralism, and people they can't simultaneously say they don't want fragmentation. Like in other words, they're both interpretations of differentiation, and that in order to set, but we are raised to treat differences as rather threatening, and I think it takes a rather character transforming type of practice to enable the interpretation of plurality when we see differences rather than fragmentation, and that's not easy. Yeah, but also seems quite essential.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you had another one on the schedule that is called communication theory. It seems like
Hmm.
that might be relevant, might be a good segue to start talking about that a little bit. What are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I find I think for me perhaps I mean I resonate with socially inept because I very much identify as that, or at least certainly identified in past tense as that. Um, and so I have a lot of, you could say, I find the demographic very endearing, generally speaking. Um, the students I teach tend to be, I mean, look, we're all learning how to be more socially apt. It's not easy to be socially apt. And One of the things that I found has helped me, and think people like me, including how people somewhat taught me, is to rather than focus a lot on the human side of things, to, for the moment at least, we will strip away the humanity part of it and just talk about the notion of agents, where we're like, oh yeah, suddenly we get a lot more like tangibility on agents rather than humans. And kind of go, well, how does two entities transmit messages anyways? And when we can model out a sufficiently useful model for it, like what goes on inside an entity, or at least what probably goes on inside an entity, and what goes on between entities, will allow us to identify locations for solutioning where we might then go, oh, hey, that sounds like me, in a way that could then we can we can do more analytical diagnoses on it. Whereas when it's like, oh, when I talk to this woman and she didn't seem to quite like what I say, it could feel far too noisy and complex for me to approach what might have went wrong. But when we think about it in the abstract as two entities communicating, or just simply transmitting messages to each other, we can sometimes find leverage if we can identify the modeling there. And a lot of, like, you can take a university course on communication theory, and it would be able to give quite a lot of this. The hope is to be able to connect this up to human communication in a sufficiently practical way, rather than staying purely on the abstract entities level.
Speaking of the practical, do you have a couple examples, either from your life or things you've observed, or even some made up ones of how you might apply your own thoughts on communication theory to understand or navigate an interaction differently than you might have otherwise?
Yeah, here's like a little nugget that really influenced me. This is less so in strictly communication theory, but more so in cognitive science. I'm sure or maybe you're familiar with the OODA loop.
Vaguely, I see it on Twitter a lot.
Sure, sure. So the OODA loop is a basic notion of how our cognition works. So it stands for, it's OODA for OODA. It stands for observe, orient, decide, act, which are the four stages an organism will go through in its sense making to go from intake information to output some action. Um, I have or I mean, I came across a variation on this that adds a stage that very helpfully gave some insights. And so the variation here, I don't have as nice sounding as OODA, but it's PIFIA, which goes for perceive, interpret, feel, intend, act. And I would hope it's easier if I can actually write it out. But in this case, perceive would of course be observe. Interpret would be like orient. Intend would be decide. Action would be the same on both ends. But the PIFIA part as a F, the F is feeling. So the feeling part gave me a very useful like through pure just like modeling, it gave a lot of insight onto where leverage could lie. So oftentimes when let's say you we live together and you did not throw out the trash when I told you to, I might get feel angry about that or something. And there's a part that might say, well, I don't want to feel angry about that. I want to feel compassionate or something. So how can I make myself not feel angry? But one might notice that in the model here, what it really helped me with is the notion that feeling comes after interpreting. And so what that means is I can try and change my feelings, but I cannot change it until my interpretation also change. So if my interpretation of Brooke, in this hypothetical world where you did not throw out the trash, if the interpretation is that you are an irresponsible housemate who never gets anything done around the house, then it will be working quite up an hill if I try to change my feelings about being angry. But if I instead was able to say through dialogue or meditation or whatever else that helped me come across additional interpretations, that might be something like Brooke is having a really hard time with whatever she might be having a hard time with, then the feelings we will discover that without even trying to change the feelings, the associated feeling would simply change. And so I think this is a really good example of through better understandings of how our experiences could be modeled, we can find leverages that work better. And so in this model, which I quite like, it's not really that useful to change how we feel, or at least like deliberately try to change how we feel. Instead, it invites the investigation into how did the interpretation come to be the way it is.
I love that. I spent a chunk of time during my college years in Santa Cruz, sort of investigating my relationship to anger.
Mm.
And I had this deli that I worked at that was kind of
Mm-hmm.
my lab for experimenting with a lot of these
I love
things.
it.
And it was a great place for it. And
Mm-hmm.
there weren't that many things that caused me to get angry, but there was a sort of class of things that fairly reliably triggered it. It was usually someone coming in and mistreating the staff. And often they would be fairly rich tourists and things like that. And I had a hard time with that sort of like class of like righteous anger. And the process of, I'm not going to go into the whole thing right now, but it ended up being something like that where I would think about what could have led them to have a day like that. What I could have maybe done differently to be more compassionate, and I would consider it a win state when I would get into a situation where normally both of us would have left very angry, even if I felt like I had like won the argument or won
Yes.
the
Yes.
interaction.
Uh-huh.
That was still not a win case. The win case was when we both left feeling better than we had before,
Yes.
and I was sort of very intentionally tried to create those kind of situations. It was very impactful
Yeah, and what
series of experiments.
transformative heroic work was happening in a deli? I bet the owner didn't even know the incredible things that was happening there. And truthfully, I think that's
Yeah.
really
So that's yeah.
I think that's quite the what I most love about it is that it happened in a deli, because I think part of this thing about social research is that like there is no place where it cannot be a laboratory. And so I think a deli is just as good as a place as a think tank to understand how these things work.
Yeah, yeah. I think that when you really embark on a journey of trying to understand how to human better, basically everywhere is a laboratory. There are opportunities to learn from anything, either things that you can try to replicate that went well, or things that you can try to fix if they didn't go quite as well as you would have liked. So I want to switch pace a little bit, switch gears. So you have a couple on here that are sort of in the relationship category,
Mhm.
which is kind of one of the reasons why I feel like it's a compelling idea to do something like the School for the Socially Inept. We have the loneliness crisis, we have the falling fertility rates, people aren't getting married, people aren't really, they're struggling to find relationships, and I think that learning about these sort of skills could go a long way towards, even just on a local level, sort of helping people engage with the world in a healthier way and find the relationships that they need, or have their social needs met, maybe, so they are less desperate to get into an unhealthy relationship. So you have uh, one here that's the ooh, my handwriting is not easy to read. Relationships, the threads that weave minds together. Did I get that title
Yes,
wrong?
I do
Can you speak a
believe
little bit
that
on that
is
one to
the
start?
I do believe that is the title, but I'll need to let me revisit the description itself so I can see what I mean by that. Let's see. Yeah. I'll note this is also the one where I said I have no idea what this is going to be yet, so TBD.
Is my
Okay.
fault for
Yes.
not doing more than writing down the title as preparation for this interview.
Yeah. No, no. I mean, this is actually so what I have no idea what to do about this one yet. Not because it's under prepped. It's more like it's too dense and rich for me to know immediately how to condense it down because this topic is very
Mm.
central to my heart um, and tries to put in ideas that are yeah very very central to what I think life is like capital L life as well as what it means to be alive as a human um, and so I want to start with taking a little bit of two words that you used just now that I want to reframe slightly. One is relationship. What is a relationship? I think too common when we usually say I'm in a relationship. The in between the lines, you know that I just described I am in a romantic relationship. It would be pretty strange if I go to my parents and say, "Mom, I am in a relationship," and it's like, "Oh, who is the nice lady?" And it's like, "No, actually, it's just I'm just in a friendship with somebody." It's like that would be kind of strange. And but instead it's to say that relationship is simply the fact that there exists a bond between a connection between two humans in this case. We could take it even more abstract in terms of like, all connection between all things. But in this case, it's to say that when we pedestalize romantic relationships and think, oh, we'll finally have the one and whatnot, um, we end up forgetting that we get better through relationship, through all of the relationships that we're in, and that trying to be really, really good at just one while ignoring all of the other one is probably not going to go that well. Um, and so, what is a relationship is a key part. I don't mean threads that weave minds, as in have a bunch of romantic relationship that creates a really beautiful mind. It's more so that any given human existing is it any human that exists and will ever exist and have existed um, all situate themselves in a bundle of relationships to everything else. Like I may not, for example, or suppose I didn't live with anyone, and suppose that I basically buy all of my food through Uber. Well, I still have relationship through the Uber driver and the kitchens that actually produce that food, for instance. There's simply no away from that. And so any ignorance or blindness to that ecology of the relational web of which we are already a part of will only result in a kind of blindness to how we are already constituted. And of course, naturally, if we then only focus attention on any part of that web, let's say a romantic relationship, or let's say a friendship, it doesn't matter. Any selective focus on just one part of the web will lead to odd pathologies, is my both observation and understanding. The other thing that I want to change, which is related to, well, then how do we even serve relationships, is that when you brought up the notion of skills, like that there are skills that we can learn. And granted, yes, I think there are many, many skills that we can learn. Like for instance, when I picked up nonviolent communication, for instance, it greatly, greatly enhanced my ability to communicate with other people. It was very useful. However, skills alone does not relationships make. And there is a thing here about when relationships are built in the lives that we share, not necessarily in the workshop that we share, even the workshop is a part of life as well. And so you can't expect to simply deploy nonviolent communication into your partnership and expect the partnership to just magically get better. It's woven through iteration after iteration, and skills alone will not be enough.
Yeah, I saw some tweets going around recently that were along the lines of you should date a bunch of people and therefore you will get better at being a partner and at dating. And I
Mhm.
think there is some truth to that, but I think
Absolutely, yeah.
people kind of lose sight of the fact that like if your friendships, getting better at your friendships will also make you a better partner, and I've definitely seen that in my own life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a pitfall in the shape of when I finally find the right person or even the right group of people, I will commit all my heart into it. But by then you will be a huge novice at committing your heart into people. And now granted, committing your heart often can lead to heartbreak, and one needs to know how to maturely relate to that heartbreak, that is definitely going to be a feature, probably.
I'd love to hear a little bit, continuing this topic. You have another one that's titled Beyond Romance. You're in a relationship, now what? So,
Hmm.
ideally, we've kind of gone over things that help you communicate better broadly within different kinds of cultures. We've gone over how your different relationships across your life impact who you are as a person in romantic relationships and outside of them. So, what do you say about what do you do once you're in a romantic relationship?
Yeah, what to do indeed. Well, for one, there are fortunately many, 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 many books that, and many, many, many thinkers and practitioners who have summarized their knowledge and presented them in ways far better than I would have or will. And um, somebody's work who I really like, and I'm about to actually speak from her work, is someone named Susan Campbell, who I quite respect and has been in this for some, 40, 50, 60 years or something. And I think one of the key part, and I'll just use myself as an example, for instance. Romantic relationship, I mean, still matters a lot to me. It used to matter to me a great deal, partially because it I wanted it because it wasn't a validation. I deeply believed that I was unpopular. I deeply believed that I was unable to be popular, and that the evidence I would need to see to be popular and liked or loved is if girls would like me. Um, and naturally, I did a lot of work, gaining skills on how to get girls to like me, quote unquote. But as it turns out, none of those actually add up to good relationships. Like you can get to the point where somebody who would say, "Oh yes, I really do like you too. Let's go on a date. Let's actually have a relationship together." But you notice actually no, that's where the starting line actually happens. The what happens beyond that? I don't know. I was just trying to be popular. It doesn't really answer the question of what actually builds a great partnership. And to that end, it's a whole different, I would say, a slightly overlapping, but also broadly different domain of work on how do you build a flourishing partnership than how do you become a popular person. They're quite different things, and oftentimes I think we aim for what we think we want, where in reality we want something else. And there was a realization process I had to go through to go, okay, I have to let go of this being popular thing. It's not just about having girls like me. It's actually about how do I have a good relationship, and that then becomes a whole different learning journey. And I think that's a pretty necessary thing. And so, with respect to this, what would probably be I guess, a lecture or an activity of some kind. It's about at least trying to visualize a bit. Okay, so let's try and get past that. It's not just perhaps you've been in relationships before, perhaps you've never been in a relationship, but can we at least visualize a little bit what kind of relationship do we actually want? Not just from the point of view of, say, myself, like what kind of partner do I want? Not like that, but in the what kind of relationship does myself and my partner would want to be in? What kind of dynamic would that look like? What would that feel like? How would development look like there? Because both of you will change over the course of that relationship. And so, and usually that change is what can, destroy relation. You're not who I met, or like you're no longer the person that I fall in love with. It's the most classic reasons why breakup happens. And how to think through that developmental process is what will actually give, I think, non-naive, meaningful longevity to that relationship. Imagine being able to talk about all of this with your partner. How wonderful would that be?
This is so I have put in a lot of work in introspecting and understanding kind of why I do a lot of the things that I do and figuring out better ways to show up in the world, ways that I'm proud of. And there's like, I tell people that I make the kinds of events that I would like to go to, and School for the Socially Inept is no exception. And sort of the class of things that I still feel very much out of my depth in and need to do a lot of work on are these sort of like romantic areas, trying to
Mhm.
figure out when signals are just somebody being friendly versus when somebody's romantically interested in me, trying to figure out what I actually want, because that evolves over time. I that what you said about popularity really resonated with me. I had a period in high school where I it, it was popularity, and it was popularity across a bunch of different subcultures. At one point I was like, oh, I want to be one of the popular kids, and I don't think this is part of that. But then after that, I was like, no, they're terrible. I want to be one of the smart kids, and then one of the cool kid. Just different types of people. And with each one, it was I think even somewhat explicitly, I was thinking about it in these terms of finding so with the smart one, I found the guy who was like the smartest in my class. It was kind of like general, like generally everybody was like, yeah, that guy's the smartest. And then if I could date him, that meant I was also smart by proxy. Because of course they would never date somebody who wasn't also smart.
Mm-hmm.
And that did not, as you can imagine, did not necessarily go very well.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't help me feel smarter, and also wasn't good relationships. And that across a bunch of different subcultures. And I've gotten away from doing that a little bit, but I still think that there's a lot that I have left to learn just in differentiating between like what things feel good and are good for me, and what things feel good and are not good for me.
And also adding in the product here, which is what would also feel good for the other person and what might not feel good for the other person and why. Because I think it would be really
No.
sad if, somebody, it's like if let's say my partner learns that I only date her because I wanted the validation of a really pretty woman that I'm dating. Like, they're a human being. That's another
No.
human being that you're using as a right. It's a very, but also we are all, this is a very unfortunately quite common thing as I account for it, the world. And better, rather than shaming each other into not talking about it, it would be best to have some context where we can talk about it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a couple on here that are, I get to switch gears a little bit, that
Hmm.
are seem a little bit, I wasn't able to like lump them together thematically. One is playing with posture and speech. Can you tell me a little bit about what's behind that and why you thought it would be a good thing to add to this kind of curriculum?
Yeah. This was inspired by one sec. Let me think this for a moment. I think yeah, sure. I think this is fine. This is inspired by Chao Chu, who I met like many years ago now, I guess. Um, and when I first met him, he was in a period where he was very actively exploring feelings and whatnot, which I imagine, for those who know Chao Chu is pretty familiar with that. And he, I think, inspired me to think about exploring these things in a way that is more about exploration and not about getting better. Now, one could keep in mind that we are trying to improve along some axes, but when people talk about posture or speech, I think Toastmasters or something like people improving you deliberately to become the kind of symbol of power presentation that humans would find naturally like appealing, but instead but I think what that takes away from, I mean, for one thing, is like it's basically telling everybody to be the alpha male in a way that I don't really like, but it's more so that we lose the part where we're actually coming into understanding with ourselves, the exploration of what would it feel like if I were to be in this kind of posture versus that, not about which one is better. If anything, we're going towards which one do you like better? The unique subjective human being that's actually experiencing it, whether it's talking faster, talking slower, standing taller, maybe deliberately having a hunchback just to see how it feels for those who, for some reason, have really great, straight back or something. Like it's about exploring what's different, not only for self-improvement, but also for understanding others. I think one of the things that is, so I am fairly tall, and that it's one of the things that I think is very strange is, for the most part, I don't really know what it's like to be shorter. And simply just like, for example, putting myself on a wheeled chair, for example, and wheeling through different spaces from a completely different height, imagining somebody grabbing, like it sounds stereotypical, but it's about a perspective taking experience. What is it like to live in another person's experience? That's the thing that I think is far more than simply improving oneself to be more appealing, attractive, or whatever. As it turns out, though, I think this actually does make you far more attractive.
Yeah, as you know, and as probably most people follow me on Twitter know, I've been taking this very long public speaking course, and it's just uncovered a trove of really, really interesting things about myself and about the way that I kind of show up in the world and my own anxiety and things like that. And paying attention to like watching recordings and looking at my body language during them has been super eye-opening. My coach Danielle Benson, she talks a lot about connecting with people and about how that's really the point of all of this, is learning how to really connect with people. And just to say, one of the things she said very early on that stuck with me was that people, when you are speaking to a group, no one's going to be thinking about all the things you're doing wrong when you're connecting with them, when you really have their
Yes.
attention. Then they're just involved in the story. They're invested in what's happening. And looking, I mean, I would be kind of like, it just wasn't super noticeable for me. It wasn't the kind of thing I would have noticed had I not taken the time to watch myself trying to speak just to a camera. No one else is there. My own phone in the garage or something. And I've got kind of one foot this way. I'm like a little bit sideways. My hands are, I look like I'm about to flee. And when I see other people looking that anxious, it happens on a very subconscious level, but it makes me feel less connected with them. And so I've been sort of paying more attention to my posture, and even less so about trying to forcibly change it. But when I'm in a room, am I kind of sitting like this, or am I more relaxed? And if I'm sitting like this, what is it about my relationship with that person that's causing me to sort of
Yes.
be less
Yes.
present or a little bit more closed off? It's just an endless thing, an endless supply of really interesting things that I've now started to pay attention to and think about that I hadn't been before.
Yes, and I think it makes a huge cognitive difference, kind of recalling the earlier thing about the OODA loop. When we are, let's say, I'm crossing my arms in a conversation, and I notice, oh, this seems to say that I'm closed off. I could have the interpretation of I should be open. Open is good, and I just kind of pry my arms open so that I can be open. And then there's another mode that's something like noticing that I'm doing this, and yeah, like you said, what is the relationship going on here that I seem to be doing this? And the understanding there, which ironically again turns out is actually more conducive to being open rather than prying one's own arms open. And the seeking to understand here, both in one's own experience and others, I think is the kind of social aptness that is unfortunately just not well taught anywhere, broadly speaking. It's not a real curriculum. There's no such thing in school as learn this thing. And that's, I think, quite unfortunate. And it's like, look, the socially inept thing is hardly a rare condition that few people like suffer from. It's like a global epidemic of social dysfunction.
Sense. I mean, I spent a long time thinking about these more actively in some periods of my life than other periods, but I kind of had to, and I think that's a hallmark of a lot of the people that we're bringing in as hosts here. They are people who had to think about these things
Yeah,
because they just
yeah,
they weren't working,
yeah,
and not everybody has that kind of a great privilege. That I live the
yes,
kind of life that forced me to think about
yes,
things, because my life is so much richer as a result.
yeah.
And I feel pretty strongly that these kinds of things should be shared, should be taught, should be just communicated even between peers. Although we are opening this event up to people 16 and above.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is something I feel quite strongly about.
Yeah, and then there's the whole question of, how do we teach these things if we were never really taught these things, right? So it becomes like we're inventing the pedagogy of it as it goes, while trying to scrounge together whatever fragments of and nuggets of like older wisdoms of people who did teach these things that we can find. And it's not easy. And sometimes we also make mistakes. There are also times when like other people have said to me like, oh, the thing that you mentioned actually it's like wrong because of these reasons, and probably they're right because the context wasn't appropriate for them. And it's not an easy thing to communicate with each other because, and this is one of the things that I really hope for. It's like the hosts are also learning. And we are also trying to figure out a lot of these things ourselves. I come partially because there are other hosts that I'm like, oh, I hope you can teach me more about X, Y, and Z, for instance.
Yeah, I feel like even with people who have had to think really hard about, we all kind of have our own sort of particular interest areas that we've thought a lot about, and that we've gained some level of expertise in that. We've spent a lot of hours on it, not in that we are always correct. And then there are other areas where we're just like, what, I haven't even started to think about that. I have no
Hmm.
idea what I'm doing. So it's
Hmm.
yeah, and well. we may play around with the format of this. This is our first attempt at doing this kind of thing. I almost think it might have been better to go more with Vibe Camp style and have people
Mm,
put whatever they want on the schedule.
mm.
I like the idea of really working with the hosts and giving them enough time and space and resources to develop their content over time. And maybe we'll get better at that. But we're still sort of playing around with formats. But I do think that I would like this to work. I would like this to be a thing that we keep doing.
Yeah. And the way that I see it is that, humanity is in a grand learning experiment of how to incorporate some of these things. Because, like even when we first came onto the call, without explicitly trying to, we both sort of recognized that slowing down a little for a few minutes was helpful for both of us, and naturally, we just ended up doing that. And I think that's quite a remarkable thing. Like, never mind that we did it, but we also did it without really needing to coordinate on it. And like we are all. It's a pretty and that is rare as far as I can tell. It's not common. You can't really assume that of most contexts. And so we're all learning how to do this as humanity. Really, is how I hold it. And yeah, one experiment at a time. One vibe camp at a time, one school for the socially inept at a time, and hopefully we can trade notes in a way that we can learn from each other and iterate on those collective experiments, which is another subject, I think.
Yeah, for context for people listening, I had a meeting that was going kind of late, and then some things happened with my house, and then I wanted to play with the lights and sort of figuring out what configuration I like in the office. And then we get on the call after I'm doing all these things, and we were able to, let's just like check in for a few minutes, sort of slow the pace down, and
Mhm.
it did feel very natural, and it was very helpful. I definitely noticed a big shift, and there was a point in time which I was like, okay, I could do this without feeling harried now.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think of Vibe Camp as being in some ways a an onboarding platform. It is a big party, and for some people it will always just be a big party. But I think for a lot
Mhm.
of people, they're sort of exposed to new ways of being in the world, new ways, new kind of like different therapeutic modalities or systems of thinking that they wouldn't have been exposed to otherwise. And I think that's one of my favorite things about it. And there's just like so much out there with all of
Yes.
these people who
Yes.
are kind of on the forefront of like thinking about like how to human better.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I want to bring in, like your earlier thing about how different it's the thing about different worldviews again, where it's like the world contains so much and so much more than one could ever fathom, and the what it means to be socially apt, for example, is still going to be defined by some entity going socially apt means X, Y, and Z. Turns out it means A, B, C, and so forth. And it's like or at least it could also mean all of those things too. And there's so much more possibility to explore there. And yeah, any like wormholes that could allow you to like warp into the plurality of just how much more there is in a way that's like hopefully not too overwhelming. I think is one of the greatest gifts that we can be blessed by, basically.
Amazing. I love that so much. Thank you so much for taking this time. I'm going to go ahead and oh, do you have anything that you want to plug while you're here? I know. So the interesting thing about these live streams is that I
Mm.
have because it's going through Twitter. It would be different if I did it through Riverside, but because it's going through Twitter, I have no idea while these are happening if anyone's watching them.
Uh-huh.
Luckily, I mean, this time Sammy messaged me immediately and was like, "It's not working." But
Right.
we could have 10 people watching this, or we could have 1,000. So that's
Mm.
always a sort of interesting place to be in and not be able to watch that number tracking. But
Mhm.
while we have you here, is there anything that you want to plug?
Yeah. Bear with me here because it's also my first time deciding if I even want to plug anything. Because I actually have something to plug now, whereas in the past I usually just go no. Um, I think I think it would make sense. I have a Substack. I started writing a couple months ago, and if people found what we talked about here to be resonant and interesting, much of what I write about these days are in that direction. And the Substack is just davidxu.substack.com. So um, feel free to give me feedback because I welcome that. Yeah.
Just a reminder. School for the Socially Inept is taking place at Lighthaven in Berkeley from November 1st through 3rd. And there will be plenty of this and much more. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Thank you so much, David.
Great.